Good day, everyone. Welcome to all of you who are joining us this afternoon or this morning or wherever it is that you're signing in from. We do not take your presence for granted, and we're really grateful for you to be joining us in this conversation. This is the first event that the Feminist Center for Racial Justice is holding this calendar year, so it holds a particular importance in our sort of event series for this year. My name is Awina Okech, and I'm the director of the Feminist Center for Racial Justice. Now, for those of you who do not know who the Feminist Center for Racial Justice is, let me take a few minutes to just say a few words about the center and why this particular scoping study and report matters to the work that we are doing. So the Feminist Center is a new center based out of SOAS University of London, and we're a center that places a premium on the importance of action research informing social justice movements work. We believe that while research is absolutely essential and important to understanding the challenges, issues, and the power dynamics that we're seeking to confront, that research in and of itself, without it being rooted and located and informing social justice work, holds no particular meaning. And that is why in all of the programs that we intervene in, we seek to ensure that there are very strong linkages between academic institutions, ourselves, who are located in an academic institution, and social justice actors who we have built relationships with over the years through multiple tracks of work that might not necessarily have been rooted within the center. We draw on those legacies, those histories of work that we have done in other places as part of what we bring to the body of work that is now sitting within the Feminist Center. The Feminist Center, of course, is quite interested in the intersection between racially just futures that are understood from a feminist politics, feminisms in their diversity, and we place a particular premium on working with regions in the majority world, largely because we are interested in narratives of racial justice that are emerging from this context. We are also interested in building greater transnational linkages and conversations across contexts that have historically organized and potentially even theorized in parallel to each other. So this is the grand mission that brings us together, the Feminist Center. And it therefore makes sense that in thinking through one of the most important pieces of work that we wanted to begin to use to understand the lay of the land, migrant domestic worker organizing in the Arab region was one of the things that we chose to focus on. But before I delve into the migrant domestic worker and why that particular theme was important, last year, the Feminist Center commissioned a series of scoping studies. And the purpose of these scoping studies was for us as a center to understand the lay of the land around a particular set of thematic priorities that we were interested in. And in order to do so, we thought it was important to reach out to researchers who are located within and outside institutions of higher learning or research institutions as a way to understand what is the literature saying about particular thematic questions, what is happening within the social justice field, so that any work that we then sought to engage in this year and the years to come emerged from a place of building on and leveraging what is already happening rather than reproducing work that has already been done by organizers, but also by researchers. The area of migrant domestic worker organizing, if it bears, if it's worth repeating for this particular audience, I think for many of us, we have observed the sort of harrowing tales of migrant domestic workers, whether they're coming from Southeast Asia, Asia broadly, or the African continent, and their experiences in different parts of the Arab region. We are also acutely aware, many of us who have sort of thought about feminist organizing through different vantage points about the system, the kafala system that sort of creates a particular dynamic of almost semi-slavery for domestic workers who are moving to various countries in the Gulf and Arab region to seek work and employment. But alongside that, there is an additional dynamic, and here I speak as somebody from the African continent, that this movement of labor from one context to another, from, if you want to call it, receiving countries to the countries that are producing this labor, is also undergirded by deeper socioeconomic questions that lead particular groups of people, often racialized, gendered in particular ways within their own context, that lead them into vulnerable employment that is unprotected by their own governments and end up in contexts where they're equally unprotected. So there is a very interesting dynamic that is happening in relation to government and state policies on either end that is really rooted in dynamics of vulnerability that seek to really continue to marginalize, if you will, groups that are already decentered in their own home countries. Often these are people who are coming from rural areas or living on the margins of our urban cities, and who are therefore at the mercy of often dodgy employment agencies that take advantage of the sort of long legacies of lack of formal education systems, but also the deep impoverishment that many people find themselves in due to the lack of inclusive socioeconomic policies in our own countries that lead them to these particular sets of dynamics. So we're quite happy when we found a group of researchers that were willing to undertake this scoping study for us. And this evening or today, from wherever you're joining us, is a conversation about the findings of that particular report. So I'm going to turn over now to two of the researchers. There were three researchers who worked on this report together, but two of them join us today. And I'm going to invite them to say a little bit about who they are and why this particular study intrigued them, why they thought, okay, sure, this is something worth doing and not another thing, or creating space within their own often heavy workloads to allocate to this particular piece of work. So let me start off with you, Susan Abdulrahim. Tell us a little bit about who you are and why. Why did you take up this piece of work?
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you are situated. Thank you so much, Dr. Okesh, for this amazing introduction to this discussion and webinar. It captures a lot of our thoughts, our collective thoughts, actually, and how we approach the issue of migration, gender, and poverty and labor. I'm Susan Abdulrahim. I'm a professor of public health in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the American University of Beirut. And this year I'm a fellow at the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. I'm spending the year here until the summer. I've been involved in issues and activism related to the rights of migrant workers, particularly women migrant domestic workers in Lebanon and generally in the region. For many years, I've served on the board of the anti-racism movement in Beirut, Lebanon, that does a lot of advocacy work and also social service, provides a lot of social services to migrant workers. So I come to this from both an activist and a scholarly, both perspectives. And I'm really interested in pushing forward both the academic discourse on migration, gender, and labor in the Arab region, as well as, of course, the priority. My priority is to improve the conditions of migrant workers in the region, acknowledging, the global dynamics and the global social inequities. I'll turn to my colleague May, but I want to mention very quickly that I want to very quickly mention our third collaborator on this project, Dr. Gabriela Nassif, who is currently a researcher at George Washington University, who couldn't join us today. She's in transit traveling, but she's a researcher at the George Washington's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. She's also been very involved in organizing and work on migrant domestic workers in the Arab region. And she did a lot of the heavy lifting for the report that we're going to discuss and starting in a few minutes. So sorry, this took longer than anyone would have liked, but go ahead, May.
Hi everyone, my name is May Adra. I'm a theater artist, a facilitator, and a researcher. I teach at the American University of Beirut as an instructor, and I've worked for a while now with Susan in research, specifically on issues of women domestic migrant workers for the last several years, and I do extensive research on intersectional feminism in general. And a lot of my research revolves around when we did research with the migrant workers or participatory action research using theater forms in community settings for better experiential learning. So that's what I'm also doing now. I do research now on using theater and storytelling with nursing homes using horticultural therapy. I teach applied theater, which is using theater in these community settings. And a lot of my work is based on that overlap between research, between facilitation on the ground, using arts as a medium with different communities, be it migrant workers, women, and so forth, as well as the research world. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, May, Sosian, and Gabriela in absentia. Really, I do want to express our deep appreciation for producing this report and the work that went behind it. So let me start off with an initial question. This report covered 7 countries, and I'm interested in understanding from you, what would you say connects these 7 countries? Because they're very different, I think, in nature, but in relation to the question of migrant domestic and migrant women domestic workers, what is the sort of central connecting point about the 7 countries?
I can take this, May. So when we started working on this report, we recognized that the 3 of us know a lot about Lebanon. We know a little bit about Jordan, but actually we didn't know enough about what's happening in other countries, particularly the Gulf countries, in terms of recent or up-to-date both research and organizing through, whether through formal organizing or informal organizing. What connects these countries together is the fact that since the 1970s or 80s, there has been like an economic shift in these countries that has basically provided space for hiring migrant domestic workers as a commodity, as basically as a presentation of social status in these countries. There's been literature on the labor force participation of Arab women in the region showing that the rates of labor force participation are low to the point that they really don't justify this high rate of hiring migrant domestic workers to perform the traditional gendered labor that women provided in Arab families. So this shift in these countries that started actually in Gulf countries. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm using my phone. This shift started in Gulf countries, and then through migration, basically moved into countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. So, in fact, families that migrated from Lebanon and Jordan to the Gulf in the 70s and 80s, when they are the ones that brought back this idea of hiring a migrant domestic worker rather than a national to perform basically the gendered labor that women used to perform, and it created basically these social understandings of what it means for a family to hire a migrant domestic worker. So basically what I can say is that it's really these economic changes, that has led to the increase of hiring migrant domestic workers. If we're talking about local factors in the region, but there's also been these global shifts and global factors that have pushed a lot of women, a lot of vulnerable women from low income countries, poor countries, to migrate to a lot of countries, in Europe, in the US, and in many cases also in countries in the global south, if we want to consider, the Gulf, Jordan, and Lebanon as being located in the global south. So yeah, please let me know if you would like me to elaborate on any other point.
No, sure. May, do you want to add anything to that?
Remind me of the question. It was why this work? Why did we focus on this region?
What's the connection across the countries? If there's nothing to add, I'll just add a second question, which is connected to Lebanon and Jordan. I will add Qatar and UAE. So if you talked to, well, let me use me. If you talk to me about migrant domestic work organizing, those are the countries that stick out in my mind because they're permanently in the media. And in relation to African migrants, they're the ones that, are very sort of visible. In your findings, and I note there are 8 countries, actually not 7, in your findings in the report, would you argue that across all of these 8 countries that you examined, the situation of women domestic migrant workers is the same? Or are certain countries much more extreme than others in the sort of racialized way in which they treat domestic worker organizing? And what shapes that? So those are 3 big questions bundled together. So is there something specific about Lebanon, Jordan, and UAE and Qatar, in relation to how they treat migrant domestic workers that is different in the other countries, or are they all the same? Yeah.
No, there are differences. So countries like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait have more of like a centralized political system. And Jordan as well. So there's this idea that, high-level policies that can improve the conditions of migrant workers in Qatar and the UAE can be passed because, it just depends on policymakers in positions of power. If they buy into a certain policy, they would pursue that and make it happen. Whereas, you can think about Lebanon as being different, where the policy context is not centralized, and because of the situation in Lebanon being trapped into regional conflicts as well, that it's extremely difficult to work at the policy level, because there's this idea that the rights of migrant workers is not a priority, given all the other policy issues that are on the table, and because of the political system in Lebanon, where passing a policy is extremely difficult in a context where, there's on the surface, Lebanon is more democratic and more open, but underneath the surface, it's also a lot more difficult to pass policies and to work at the policy level in these countries. The other thing is, the difference is that Qatar and UAE have come under the international limelight, particularly Qatar in the last couple of years, in the last few years, whereby, the rights of migrant workers in construction, but also the migrant domestic workers have been discussed in the global media, so that is, whereas in Lebanon, it remains, the rights of migrant domestic workers remains an issue that is discussed in local activists, in local media, and even in international media, but not in the way that it is written about or discussed in Qatar, for example. Nonetheless, you'll find that there is a lot of literature that's written about Lebanon, and one of the reasons for this is that the environment is more open to researchers in Lebanon. So you get a lot of international researchers from U.S. and European universities who come and spend time in Lebanon and then publish a couple of pieces. And in many cases, actually, these are really good pieces written by external outside researchers, whereas the environment is more prohibitive for research in Qatar and the UAE, although you find some really good work. So, for example, the work of Rasel Pereñas, who's lived in the UAE and spent time there, is of extreme value, because you get these you get this work that is small in number in relationship to what is published on Lebanon and Jordan, but that actually is very rigorous and really advances our knowledge of basically the lives of migrant workers in these contexts, and how migrant workers basically work and connect together in order to improve their conditions. So I want to stop here and just see if May would like to add something.
Yeah, and also I'd like to add to that, as Sausan said, obviously it differs from country to country, given the political framework, given the extent of organizing, be it out in the open or not. And I think this was another very interesting thing that we had found. And I know at least Sausan and I had worked, and I think Gabriella is here in the chat, so maybe she can speak for herself in a little bit. I'm not quite sure, but at least Sausa and I had worked not too long ago on, using participatory action research where women can basically lead their own research in Lebanon, and specifically around the theme of collective organizing. And so the idea also was that there are different forms of resistance, and the scoping review really spoke to that. And so the three main threads that did tie all the countries together was the way the lens that we were looking through, which was basically by whom was the organizing, to what extent, and how was it presented. And I think it varied, which was so interesting, but it was present. To what extent, I think then is a different story. So for example, in certain countries, as Sausan was saying, maybe we wouldn't find overtly specific forms of organizing or resistance or community efforts because of certain political restraints. We did acknowledge that there might be a literature that we don't have access to, which is using social media platforms, using their own languages, using TikTok and Instagram to speak of certain issues. So, for example, I believe this came under. This was in the public at one point where there were TikTok videos in Tagalog by Filipino workers in Saudi Arabia. So, there are sort of creative forms of overcoming certain restraints in place. And I think that was really something that we recognize that exists, and we ourselves are limited, right? Given who we even are, our identities, Sausan, myself, and Gabriella, the fact that we do not speak a lot of these languages, we do not have particular connections with certain groups, whether it's, finding out more through word of mouth or through language, or even being trusted, really, and even geographically speaking, the fact that the three of us have work more or less based in Lebanon, so we have easier access. But that being said, you can then see through the scoping review that it really plays a big role. What were present in academic texts, as Sausan said, that were very important for us to base our work on, such as articles on Miso forms of resistance, Pandey's work, what are resisting through balconies, resisting through public or private spaces, but then also finding work that is more out of the norm. So through social media, through artistic texts, through song, through dance, through performance. And maybe even having their stories but shared by someone else as a form of distancing for safety as well. So that's even another type of resisting in a way, without having their face publicly in the forefront because of security and safety reasons. So there were all these very, very interesting ways of organizing that really differed from country to country, given the different context of each space.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to come back to the point on organizing, but let me stay a little bit here with the question of literature. And I wondered if you could share with me off the top of your head, if you think about the scholarship that exists on this subject in the region, if you were to categorize it in some big clusters, what would those clusters be? Sure. And where would you say are the sort of glaring gaps in relation to scholarship in this area?
Yes. So I think one of the things to one of the ways of clustering the literature on migrant workers in the region is chronological, actually, and that's what we found, whereby there's really important literature that has been published on migrant workers and their rights in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. I mean, it was really important because it really put the issue of migrant workers' rights on the table. However, that literature was looking at it in retrospect through a different lens in 2023 is actually problematic because that literature focused a lot on the abuse and the vulnerability of migrant workers to an extent that it actually silenced migrant workers and almost, I don't want to use very loaded terms, but almost dehumanized them as you know, a group of people who passively accept oppression. And you know, a lot of this literature acknowledges the global context of inequalities. But then, you know, later in like 2000, in the late 2010 and later, you start to see literature that is written by scholars who come from more social science backgrounds and who have spent time interacting and working with migrant workers, and who have done, in many cases, who come from like the disciplines of anthropology or sociology, and who have spent time basically doing in-depth research. And then you start to see that there's a different focus. So you start to see terms like what May mentioned, meso-level forms of resistance. The words agency come out, solidarity economy, counter spaces. These are all things that have been written about, I would say, in the 2012, 2015, and later, by a handful number of researchers, actually. So that literature does not negate, you know, the oppressive nature of kafala, does not negate the racism. However, it shifts the lens a little bit and focuses on how migrant women themselves are resisting, if we want to use the term resisting, or managing and coping, at least, with that context in ways that maintain their well-being and basically psychology, their livelihood in these contexts. And a big part of how they do this is actually through these this networking and connections with each other. So this is what we found in the literature review, is that there's a focus more in recent writings on the migrant workers themselves as subjects and not as objects of study, and on the ways through which they form these networks and they resist through the concept of everyday resistance to this oppression. So we see a lot of this, and in addition to that, again, what May mentioned is the literature also, the very recent literature, started to guide us into how women organize using social media, which was not written about earlier. And in the context of COVID and other economic issues that are happening in the countries where migrant workers, where women migrant workers live. Also, this idea of mutual aid, basically this horizontal, rather than focusing on how the national organizations by activists and well-intentioned, individuals who form groups to support migrant workers and advocate on their behalf, we start to see a little more focus on how migrant workers themselves create these networks, mutual aid networks, and what's called solidarity economy to support each other. And this is really important for their survival, really. And we hope to see a lot more on this in future research, and to understand it better, to understand how these mutual aid systems function, and how women get connected with each other in these difficult contexts. Yeah, hey.
And I'd like to add to that as well, based on your question of, academic literature. And I think it's important to start shifting the narrative of what counts as academic literature, right? I think it is very important for us to kind of move into untraditional waters of, a piece of performance can be academic literature, or a piece of or a photo exhibition displaying certain, starting off conversations is a form of academic literature. And I think playing into that and really expanding what is considered academia as well really, really makes it more inclusive and opens up the margins of what communities and what identities even make the cut, really, of what academia has for the longest time been considered, right? Which is usually that those of communities who've always been having the upper hand, be it identity and privilege and oppression. And I think when we start off from there, that really opens up the horizon of, great. So what is the literature out there? It's moving away from just the very useful but very traditional forms of academia written, and really delves into the academia that is a little less accessible, maybe, right? It's not as easy to find. It's not on the the tips of our fingers using databases and libraries. And I think that in itself is very important to highlight because that really expands the literature we can learn from, the connections we can learn from, the tactics, the strategies used, and as Sausan said, the ways of coping, not just collectively, but also individually, and how the individual strategies and coping and collective strategies and coping really can go hand in hand, or they could be different, right, based on as well what someone believes is at stake, and is like, this isn't my home country. I have a family to feed, or the other way around, where it's like, oh, okay, no, I need to fight for the rights. But there are real consequences. And I think it is important to say, and I think in our scoping study, we tried to highlight organizations that we knew existed, but then fell apart or closed down because certain figures were then deported, right? So unfortunately, I think that then impacts what even is considered in the scope of the literature. And that being said, I'd like to just add that a lot of the literature, again, we were trying our best to share the academic pieces, the academic organizations, the work on unions of formal organizations such as those in Bahrain, but those also that have been working informally for a really long time. And we really wanted to focus on the literature, even in academia, led by workers, but also into the murky territories of spaces and stories by migrant workers, using the arts, using photo exhibitions. A few examples that we touched upon were, for example, a photo exhibition that happened quite a while ago by someone who I don't believe was a migrant worker herself, but she did belong to one of the communities that often, do send in migrant workers here. And so she did a whole photo exhibition around migrant workers, but also mixed race children who fall into that. So I think it's also expanding the intersectionalities of that, and not just having conversations over the identity of being a migrant worker, but also, a lot of migrant workers are mothers. A lot of migrant workers are, of this identity, of that identity. And we really did start seeing that in the literature, in performances such as Tilka or Nashr Ghassil, which are both were performances. Tilka turned into a documentary, both by an organization called Scenario, and both included migrant workers, but also Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, to youth members who grew up in foster homes. One is a Black Lebanese and the other isn't. So I think it's also expanding those identities that goes just beyond simply being a migrant worker in certain literatures.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for that, May. If I may push back a little bit, one of the things I generally am nervous about is when we try and collapse what I would call knowledge production into academic literature, right? Because there are things that many people do that I do not want to be called academic literature, because it takes away really from the richness of grounded and embodied ways of thinking. And there's something much more expansive about thinking about knowledge production writ large, and asking us to reframe how we think about knowledge without having to argue that, going through ethics committees, ensuring that you have reached your saturation sample, and, participation, action research are and narratives or film are one and the same thing. I think it's about challenging how we think about knowledge and recognizing that knowledge is sitting in various places and it is valid, and that we must pay attention to it. Those of us who sit in the academy, and even those of us who do not, and that sort of conversation across knowledges is a really important one to think with. I think I find that a useful way to think about it. I want to move now to this central point around organizing. And one of the things, and to split it in two ways. So the first bit is to recognize, based on the context that you've mapped out, political and economic, that there's obviously a reason why you see such a rich, what I would call rich, tapestry of work in a place like Lebanon. There's clearly a historical logic to that, which I wanted you to say a little bit about, because if we looked at the mapping, seems to be a lot happening in Lebanon, while not in other areas. I don't want to make assumptions about the logics of that. So if you could just say a little bit about that. And the second bit that I wanted to invite a reflection on is that, is there anything to say about organizing across these countries that is happening in any shape or form?
Yeah, so I'm going to just make a little point, and then Sawsan, I think you can take over regarding the tapestry of the work and the organization. I think this goes a little bit into what you just shared, Awino, and I completely agree with you regarding knowledge production. And I think it is very, very important to expand what is academic to go beyond that form of exactly what you're saying, sending in an IRB and right. So really, because appreciating that whatever fits as non-academic is just as valid as academic and can be considered as academic. And I think breaking out of that bureaucratic way of thinking of just because someone doesn't have a certain degree in a certain way doesn't mean whatever work or whatever art or whatever knowledge that has its richness is not considered in that knowledge production. So I'm completely with you on that. And I think that is something very important to state, because that then impacts the sort of references or the literature we look into when we are considering the tapestry of work. I think regarding your question of the cross work or certain literature that was a little more difficult for us to find, or maybe it was easier to find, but we just didn't have our, the networking in those regions. I think Sawsan can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I want to answer the question about Lebanon. I mean, there are two factors. One important factor is that we have been living and working in Lebanon. So even before starting to work on this report, on this scoping review, we knew where to go and to find things in Lebanon. Whereas with other countries, mostly Gabriela actually invested time trying to find out, to our pleasant surprise, about all these like formal and informal ways in which migrant workers have been organizing. So we didn't know that there was a union in Bahrain, or the beginnings of a union. We didn't know that there were these organizations or networks, informal networks, that of Sri Lankan women, for example, in the Gulf that existed. So because of our positionality, this ended up happening, but also because there is more on Lebanon. I mean, we invested quite a bit of effort to find out about what's going on in other countries in the region, particularly North African countries as well, where domestic hired, paid domestic work is mostly done, or there's mostly a system of hiring poor, vulnerable, rural young women to work in domestic service in these countries. But we invested time to look into things in North African countries as well. So, and Lebanon is, again, on the surface, is seen as a more open society where the Lebanese citizens and even non-citizens can openly critique the government, politicians, and basically work on social issues openly, or advocate openly, which may not exist in the United Arab Emirates or Kuwait or Bahrain, for example. But then, to our surprise, you find out that there's a more viable union in Bahrain than there is in Lebanon. Because despite all the organizing in Lebanon, you know, the policy at the policy level, they can just say, well, non-citizens cannot organize, and we're just going to ignore you. So that's this is, you know, what I wanted to say about Lebanon. There's a more active civil society in Lebanon than in any other country in the region. But then there's also a system where it's a lot more difficult to get things done because of the context in Lebanon. With respect to the transnational organizing piece, absolutely, what we're moving into, what we're finding is that there is a move towards transnational organizing. In the participatory action research study that we conducted, we knew that, you know, the participants from Kenya, the participants from the Philippines were saying, you know, we send messages to, we organize with people in Kenya or the Philippines. We send messages saying, don't come here, or if you come, make sure that you take these things into consideration. There's also, you know, the IWDF, the International World Domestic Workers Federation, there's the Alliance, and these are organizations that try to bring to basically to lift organizing across national groups and transnationally. And we actually we you know, we believe that this is I'm personally very interested in continuing to observe what is happening in terms of transnational organizing. And some of the other work I want to do with respect to bringing migrant workers together to organize around the provision of older adult care. I'm also interested in you know, these connections between caregivers in countries where they have a little bit more rights to caregivers who don't have, who basically whose rights are trampled on, and who are not provided with, who are not compensated for care work. Rather, they are treated as domestic workers, as women who provide domestic services. Not that there's, I'm not undervaluing domestic work. I'm just saying that there are migrant workers who provide specialized elderly care who are compensated as domestic workers in the context of Lebanon, Jordan, and other countries. So just, you know, I think it's really important to observe into the next few years how this organizing across ethnic national groups and transnational organizing between sending countries and host countries, how that takes place. The return migrants will play a really important role in this transnational organizing as well.
And I'd like to add on that as well. When it comes to transnational organizing, as Sausan said, it's you know, I'll use the example of our work because that's where we got to have these conversations firsthand. We realized when we started the work, we had people of well, as many backgrounds as we could, really. We had from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Kenya, Nepal, and I am missing one.
Sri Lanka. Yeah.
I think I said, okay, and Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
That's it. So basically we, when we started having these conversations, there was at first a narrative that, did creep into the conversation, which was, how domestic migrant work here, unfortunately, it's sort of like ranked of like who gets a better paid salary based on one's identity, right? And one's, and certain stereotypes that is attached to certain identities, be it if someone, there was conversation between those who were like from Nepal and Philippines and those who were from Kenya. And so that did make its way into the conversation. And that was something that we had talked to the organization where we worked with them, Anti-Racism Movement, who did tell us that will probably be something that comes up. That's something they often find when it comes to organizing or efforts between different groups, that sometimes they collaborate really, really well, actually. If anything, certain groups may have tensions within their own identity, within their own communities, and sometimes there is that tension, right? There is that certain tension of the color of one's skin playing into the whole situation, and certain stereotypes as well. So I think that then that made us realize we wanted to have this conversation of intersectionality to allow for the dialogue and the conversation of, yes, migrant workers will face many of the same challenges, but it's also very important not to clump in all of the challenges, because the way one presents and the way one identifies does play a role, right? So and it was important for us to have those conversations, and it was very interesting because we did have people of those different ethnic backgrounds, but we also had someone who was very out and open as a trans man and Filipino worker. And so he was very, very open about that. And so even the conversation of migrant work and queerness, which is often entirely excluded from the conversation, we didn't talk about it maybe directly, but I think the fact that that was even in the background in itself led its way to us thinking now, having these conversations. And even when that migrant worker had to leave the country and go back to the Philippines, I think it was a very fortunate that they were able to continue with the project, but it's probably as well that they were, a lot of people may not have had that luxury, that with the time difference, they were willing to join all the sessions and come in for the for the final performance of the results. So, I think allowing for that space as well and having those conversations does play a very big role into then the way the results shape out, and the way the feedback is received over, what are strategies and what are things that do come up that not all of the migrant workers may face at the same level. So I think that is very important and core to this idea of transnational work, of people in the same country of different ethnicities, but also across different countries and cultures.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I didn't realize that. No, go on.
Apologies, and I wanted to add one big one that came up was when the workers did research, when they did the interviews with other women, several of the women mentioned something that didn't come up in our literature very much, which was the mother's struggle in Lebanon with a child of special needs and disability. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important to mention as well, because, unfortunately, a lot of women or workers who are sent here are like screened. So if they have a physical or a very clear disability, they wouldn't be sent here. But then invisible disabilities such as mental health issues or physical disabilities that their children then have are often not discussed. And that was one of the topics that did come up quite a bit, that went beyond just the abuse, which of course is important, but the challenges mothers face when it comes to these different issues and identities, I think is important to mention. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. I think what has been useful about this conversation, as well as the report is to surface the humanity of migrant domestic workers, migrant domestic women workers. So obviously what many of us focus on quite rightly is the level of violence and the experience that migrant workers are facing in this context. But then there's the quotidian, they're still living, they're still sort of navigating day-to-day life, and the fact that it is evident that the organizing by migrant domestic workers themselves is paying attention to these dynamics. I did not realize that time would fly like this, but I have one final question, and which is, what are people organizing for? So we have seen the different ways in which migrant domestic women workers are organizing through the report. I just wanted to return to the elephant in the room, which is the conversation about the kafala system and abolishing the kafala system. Based on your reading of the region, based on your reading of organizing in different ways, both by migrant workers, but also others who might be interested in this from a policy perspective. Two questions. How is that the place we need to go in relation to abolishing the system? Just a clear yes or no. And secondly, what would you observe to be the current constraints around that kind of advocacy with various governments? You're on mute.
I cannot. Sorry, I didn't realize. I didn't mute myself. Anyways, I have a strong view about basically initiatives to abolish kafala and to end kafala. We wrote about this. Gabrielle and I had many discussions about this as well, and we wrote about it in the report. I'm absolutely for abolishing the system, but the system is not only kafala, and that's what the focus on kafala misses. And actually, I think it creates a situation where if we just say let's abolish kafala, then we feel good, and we shouldn't feel good because, I argue, in one of the papers that Maya and I actually worked on. We argue that kafala is maintained by employers, by recruitment agents. Kafala is not imposed on employers and recruitment agents. It is made by them. It is created. The meanings of kafala the meanings are created by the day-to-day practices of the employers and the recruiters and of course the policy itself. But it's really not, kafala is not a written policy. Kafala is a collection of normative practices in Lebanon, in the Gulf countries. And kafala only says that, the employer is responsible. It releases the government of its responsibility. But then the type of violence, the oppression, the labor exploitation is really is driven by a complex set of racialized, gendered, even supremacist ideologies that exist in the host countries. And by saying that we should just abolish kafala without really understanding what it is and thinking about it, that, we go just to a policymaker and we want you to sign that there's no kafala, without offering, well, then how do women continue to migrate? We're not abolitionists in the sense that we don't want women to migrate and work, because they will. And we just want that to be, we want that process to be safe and non-exploitative for migrant women. Everybody has the right to migrate across borders and to work to better their lives. So the idea here is that we want to shift the lens to really talk about the important issues, and not to put, hang everything on kafala. Because I believe kafala becomes like a buzzword, whereby people who sometimes hire a migrant worker, a live-in migrant worker, would say, oh, we just need to end kafala in order to, to save ourselves from what's going on. So I just wanted to say this. I know, and I want to acknowledge that this is not at all to undermine the activism and the advocacy that is being done. I'm just, basically, I don't want to be like an elite academic lecturing organizers on the ground, but really to say we need to think about what is happening with more nuance, with more depth, and not just say let's end kafala and everything will be okay. No, not everything will be okay, because other research that we've done shows that really the employers don't know much about what kafala is and don't care to know, and their practices are driven by what they think they have the right to do, basically.
And the fact that kafala is also different from the contract, and I think we found that a lot of the migrant workers didn't really realize that. A lot of people didn't really realize the difference. And just to demystify that there are certain practices, not defending the contract at all, because it is very problematic, but there were certain practices that weren't even there, such as taking the passport or, things like that. So I think it's also demystifying it, and it's talking about how kafala is, it's not it's not a written thing, and it's a system. And we had those conversations with the migrant workers of like, what is kafala? How are your own countries involved in kafala? How do they benefit from kafala? Who are the players in kafala besides just our own government? The different governments, the economical benefits from from kafala on both ends. So really, we kind of going from this to this and really talking about the larger system at play. And that brought up very interesting conversations and even debates between the women who, were focusing on, okay, but the direct problems of kafala, which of course the legal sponsorship in itself, but then the other, the bigger system at hand. And I do want to also acknowledge, just as Sausan said, the work that is done on the ground, but also that I do know, there are certain individuals who say abolish kafala and avoid the nuance. And there are certain activists who use abolish kafala as a term to recognizing and being completely aware of the nuance. And it's sort of like a collapsed way of, like a slogan of all of that. So I also do want to acknowledge that, and not just saying anyone who uses that term is using so without nuance. And I think, Sals and I have had conversations about this, and just to kind of put it out there.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. I see that there are no questions in the Q&A, so I will give it a minute or so. But in doing so, I also just want to turn over to you, May and Sausan, if there are any final remarks or comments in relation to the findings, the reports that we have not talked about, that you want to lift up as we close.
You want to go ahead, or?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I didn't answer the question of, I want to end with this note actually, of what do women organize for? So yes, there are women who organize to abolish kafala, who are connected with NGOs, and there are women who organize basically to meet with each other, to improve their well-being and mental health. There are women who organize to shelter their children from racism in the host country. There are women who organize to basically help others who are in legal or financial problems. So there are different ways that women organize and different outcomes of this organizing. And basically there are these socio-stars in every community who basically just help other women, help other migrants. And that's why actually, and when we started our research, we were using these technical terms of community organizing and mobilization. And basically we ended up with a research question about how women help other women. And this is what kept coming up by the participants. And what we saw in the literature and in the organizations, just distributing food packages during COVID was a form of, was a critical form of organizing, because a lot of women needed that. Distributing hygiene kits, babysitting for each other. So these are the things that women organize for, in addition to organizing to abolish kafala. So I just wanted to end with this.
Surface exchanging as well. So if someone babysits for the other, those are very, very interesting. So it's like short short-term forms of helping and then long-term forms of helping. We realized there were also like community leaders or religious spaces where a lot of women through religious initiatives go in and help, sit and talk to women who are behind bars. We had someone in our group who would do that as a volunteer. So, I think a lot of these different forms are available. A lot of women who face similar issues of, with their children, of being, of mixed race, and if the husband was Lebanese or wants custody, and, a lot of these things that would come up. So yeah, as Sausan said, it really ranges.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let me again just take the opportunity to thank you, Sausan, May, and Gabriela, for the work on this report. We argued at the very beginning of this event, but also when we're commissioning you, that these scoping studies would allow us to think through the next layer of work that we wanted to do. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be announcing some recipients of some grants around some transnational research. And I think you would be proud to know that really some of the findings shaped how it is that we framed the call for research around migrant domestic work, and that really some of the work that we will be commissioning around this area is really attentive to listening to the voices of migrant domestic workers, and that being the sort of base around which we think through some of the areas and possibilities that you pointed out in the report. So let me take this opportunity once again to say asante sana, and to our guests that joined us, thank you so much for making time to be with us. This video will go online tomorrow, in the course of tomorrow at some point. So for those who have not attended, you'll have an opportunity to watch back and listen to what I thought was a very invigorating and rich conversation. I think the words leapt out of the page in very, very powerful ways. Thank you once again.
So much.
Thank you. And let me thank Lydia and Amal, who are in the background, who have also supported and put this together. Thank you so much, and be well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.